at the University of Free State. In 1999, and Professor Badat, this is the abridged version of your bio, but in 1999, Professor Badat was appointed the first Chief Executive Officer of the Council of Higher Education. In 2006, he became the first he became the first Black South African Vice Chancellor of Rhodes University, the first person to hold this post in under 2 years. Between 2014 and 2019, he was the first program director of the International Higher Education and Strategic Projects at the Mellon Foundation in New York. He's also the author of Black Student Politics, Higher Education and Apartheid, Black Man, You Are On Your Own, The Forgotten People, Political Banishment Under Apartheid, Tennis, Apartheid and Social Justice, and, as we will find out in about an hour's time, a new book titled The Roads to Rhodes University and Beyond, Adventures in Knowledge and Activism, which is, I'm told, that the first set are available outside. You can't actually get them in bookstores just yet, so I'm not sure how exactly we're going to manage the demand and influx. Professor Badat, thank you so much for making time to join us, and may we please give him a warm welcome as he comes up.
Molweni, Dumelang, Sanibonani, Goeiedag, good afternoon, and thank you for this invitation to address this conference, which seems to me wanting to bring together a number of themes under the rubric of reparative futures for the cultivation of humanity. I will proceed in 5 steps. To begin with, I will reflect on the kinds of injustice that prevail. Then I'll speak about achieving social justice in South Africa. Third, I will address the questions of reparative justice generally and in and through universities. Fourth, I will comment on decoloniality as reparative justice. I will conclude by advancing 6 theses on universities, scholarship, and reparative justice. There are at least 4 kinds of injustice. First, there's injustice that is rooted in beliefs, prejudice, and stereotypes about other people, chauvinism, intolerance, and fear of the other. Whether people of different color, different races, classes, sex, gender, sexual orientation, nationalities, cultures, religions, languages, or from certain geographical areas. Racism, patriarchy, homophobia, xenophobia, and the like reproduce social inclusion and exclusion, privilege and disadvantage, domination and subordination, and opportunities and the absence of opportunities. Second, there is an injustice that is interwoven into the social and economic structures of our society and that have developed and ossified over centuries. In some quarters, these structures and their underlying social relations are considered natural, preordained, God-given. So entrenched are these relations that it is forgotten that they are produced and reproduced by human thought and action. The rich and the powerful and the institutions that they command, especially the media, encourage and aid such forgetting on our part. The harsh reality is that today, for millions of people, the promise of human rights and the vision of a just and caring world remain an illusion. Intolerance, war and impunity, starvation and greed, power and powerlessness, all combined in a conspiracy of the powerful against the weak that invariably deepens fault lines globally and in our societies. Wealth and impoverishment, privilege and disadvantage, differing resources and opportunity, power and powerlessness are not accidents of history. They are a consequence of how our society, a capitalist society, is organized, and it is associated with colonialism and imperialism. Apartheid planning in our own country undergirded systematic inequalities in the allocation of education, health, and all other services, so that in 1994, South Africa possessed a level of income inequality among the highest in the world. The inequality between racial groups in South Africa was higher than anywhere else in the world. We remain one of the most inequitable societies in terms of disparities in wealth, income, living conditions, and access and opportunities related to employment, education, and other social services. As we speak, 6 out of 10 families in South Africa are food stressed. They do not have enough food to eat every month. Even though more people are better educated today than before, children born today are more or less guaranteed to end up in the same position as their parents. In a country where nearly half the population are unable to escape poverty, this is a damning indictment. There is a third kind of injustice, which is rooted in the flagrant abuse and irresponsible exercise of power and ethical failures by those who wield power, govern, lead, manage, and provide key public services. Think about Makanda. Those who are impoverished depend on the effective provision of public services for securing their basic needs and improving their lives. The middle classes and the rich can work their way around those things. Shortcomings undermine their dignity, compromise the development of their potential, thwart the realization of constitutionally enshrined social goals, and violate their human and social rights. In short, it perpetrates a deep injustice on the impoverished. A final kind of injustice is when institutions and leaders refuse to acknowledge their misdemeanors, human rights violations, and crimes, to apologize to victims and survivors, and to institute meaningful redress and reparations. In the face of pervasive injustice, I have 4 comments on social justice in South Africa. First, apartheid was a system of inequality in which blacks were denied equal access, opportunities, and outcomes in society at every level. Post-1994, social policy has understandably been grounded on the principle of equality, of provision, access, opportunity, and outcomes. Second, equality of treatment is a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition for eliminating systemic historical inequalities based on segregated, underdeveloped, and unequal institutions and facilities. These inequalities cannot be undone or redressed by formal equality or just democracy. Formal equality must therefore be distinguished from equity. Whereas equality refers to the principle of sameness and to uniformity and standardization, equity's impulse is fair and just treatment for all. Equity is critical if disadvantaged social groups are to achieve substantive equality. Third, meaningful redress requires commitment by the state, other institutions like business, and key actors to institute purposeful measures to discriminate positively in favor of those who are disadvantaged. Redress measures backed by material resources than purely symbolic measures are critical for advancing social equity. Fourth, while such a social justice approach is a significant advance relative to apartheid, it is still an anemic notion of social justice. For positive discrimination in the forms of affirmative action and similar measures alone leaves the status quo intact. Transformation, in contrast with improvement, reform, reconstruction, involves advancing social justice and reparative justice. It means eroding and dissolving oppressive relations and institutions, policies and practices. It involves creating and consolidating substantially new social relations amongst people, new ways of living and being, new ways of doing things. I want to now turn to reparative justice. As a dimension of social justice, reparative justice focuses on those who have been harmed, on repairing past harms, stopping present harm, and preventing the reproduction of harm. The things that I'm talking about in terms of injustice harms humans, harms people, harms children. The question of harm raises myriad questions related to the nature of the harms, their scope, and the depth and duration for their redress. Malcolm X observed that if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's no progress. If you pull it out all the way, that's not progress either. The progress is healing the wound that the blow has made. He adds, they haven't even begun to pull the knife out, much less heal the wound. Some, perhaps many, won't even admit the knife. Malcolm X raises squarely the issues of the actors who are responsible for harm, their refusal to redress harms, and even to acknowledge harms. Regarding the scope of reparative justice, usually it is about the human rights violations of individuals, sometimes of social groups. It is seldom about the social relations that underpin and enable human rights violations, or about the wrongs in the labor arena, in education, health, and other arenas. In terms of the nature of reparative justice, internationally 5 kinds of reparations have been identified: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. Time does not permit me to go into these different kinds and the measures that would be required to give effect to these reparations. Regarding the targets of reparative justice, the United Nations talks about victims, persons who individually or collectively suffered harm, including physical or mental injury, emotional suffering, economic loss, or substantial impairment of their fundamental rights. The targets of reparations are mainly individuals, though it can include social groups. Institutions, for example, like the historically black universities in South Africa, are not accommodated. Confining reparative justice to individuals does not go far enough. What about the millions of black South Africans who suffered land dispossession, forced removals and relocation, labor exploitation, and unequal education, healthcare, and recreational life? The continuities are still very visible 30 years into our democracy. So how is substantive reparative justice to be ensured beyond individual and symbolic reparations? What kind of reparative justice should extend to social groups and institutions and the communities that border Rhodes University? Is not the transformation of inherited and inequitable social relations and structures and institutional transformation, including of our universities, the kind of justice we should be aiming for? Does it not require constitutional and legal measures as well as state policies and interventions that aggressively, creatively, and effectively provide material opportunities for social groups and institutions that were harmed? Yet such reparative justice is not identified internationally, let alone promoted. It's only what the rich will accommodate. Turning to universities, I have concerns when ideas of the developmental university, the engaged university, the reparative university, or anchor institutions are abstracted from their core purposes. I consider universities to have 3 fundamental purposes. One is, as Cardinal Newman argues, the diffusion and extension of knowledge rather than the advancement of it. Newman overstates the university's knowledge dissemination purpose, but he correctly draws attention to it and to the importance of learning and teaching at universities, increasingly neglected by the chase for research subsidies amongst our universities. A university must always be more than a place that develops students' ability to pass exams. It must also cultivate their cognitive abilities and develop critically engaged citizens who ask difficult questions. This is Martha Nussbaum's idea of universities as a cultivation of humanity. Beyond students, let me add, universities are also duty-bound, I believe, to enhance the knowledge of other social groups as part of the task of creating an informed, cultivated, and critical citizenry. Not a one-way transmission, a dialogic conversation with communities and people outside of universities. A second purpose of universities is to produce knowledge that advances understanding of the natural and social worlds and contributes to humanity's scientific and cultural inheritances. This means research and scholarship of different kinds with respect for intellectual autonomy and academic freedom. To this audience, I do not propose to say much about community engagement as a third purpose of universities. I expressed my thoughts on this at length in a keynote at a national conference at Forte 14 years ago. I shared there my intellectual grappling with community engagement as a third purpose. My problem with community engagement as it was previously conceived, and my insistence that community engagement must connect with the knowledge purposes of universities. I embrace community engagement as service learning, which connects service with teaching, learning, and research. Here, it is, in Tim Stanton's words, and is here with us today, it is an important curricular innovation that is no longer an add-on disconnected from the university's core activities as previous community engagement was, and at some universities is still. Meaningful community engagement is predicated on effective teaching and research. I am sorry, if you are not a good university as far as teaching and learning and research is concerned, I'm not sure what community engagement you can be involved in. What are you providing to communities? Because communities only deserve the best of knowledge. Universities pursue their purposes in a wider social context. Issues to do with the purposes of the universities entails a deep engagement, literally and theoretically, with the notion of place, with the idea of the university as situated in place, Makanda, Eastern Cape, Wits, Johannesburg. With the idea of the university situated in place, geography, history, social relations, economics, and politics, all the forces that combine to make an empty space place. Place is not, to engage with place is to reflect on people in a place and to ask how they might inhabit the place. The ability to inhabit, as opposed to just be resident, requires detailed knowledge of a place, the capacity for observation, and a sense of care and rootedness. Place is where people form relations and social networks, where they develop a sense of community and learn, hopefully, to live with others. It offers a helpful way, place offers a helpful way of answering the persistent problem that plagues a public good conception of higher education. Which public and what good? Place is not objective or neutral, but inscribed with relations of power. How power works in and through places must be confronted. Place also speaks to knowledge as context sensitive rather than decontextualized. It urges a close relationship between theory and practice for measuring the significance and validity of the knowledge produced and disseminated. Is it useful? Rather than immunize themselves from their surrounding communities, universities understood in this frame actively seek exposure and collaboration because that's what they are for. This has implications for pedagogy, the content of curricula, research practices and priorities, and of course, for community engagement. A critical pedagogy of place enables imagining what forms of connection and action might emerge, and provides the opportunity to knit the university to the fabric of its surrounding society. It allows the university to pursue its purposes in close connection with local, national, and global challenges, and to produce a transformed epistemological practice that is both embodied and contextualized. Regarding reparative justice and universities, colonialism profoundly shaped South Africa's university system and saw the emergence largely of replicas of European universities, as opposed to universities that were organically South African or African. Universities' institutional identities, cultures, curricula, learning and teaching and research were wedded to Western intellectual thought, modes of knowledge making, conventions, and practice. Many of us are still completely seduced and enamored with Western intellectual thought. Universities largely reproduced the colonial and apartheid order, only marginally contributing to an equitable and democratic order in South Africa. So given the colonial, the racist, the patriarchal, and Eurocentric origins of universities, including the one we're at today, and the intellectual and social harm that they inflicted, a key issue has to be policies and strategies for reparative justice. I want to skip over a certain section because I want to take it as assumed that there have been many positive changes in South Africa, especially in universities since 1994, even though sometimes people don't feel it. There are over 1 million students today. The student enrollment and body has been de-racialized. There are more women than men. There's been progress on student funding for those who are needy. All kinds of positive things have happened. So spare me this thought that things were better under apartheid. Right? It's nauseating. Not recognizing the very positive changes that have happened in this country, including in universities, with all their problems. For socially committed scholars, there are 3 challenges. One is that elegant mission statements, platitudes, and genuflections aside, elites and institutions dislike acknowledging and apologizing for harm and injustice, let alone providing reparations, symbolic or material. That's the starting point. It means that reparative justice is a site of contestation and struggle. It involves taking on powerful political, economic, and bureaucratic elites in our society. Its pursuit, if we are serious, calls for commitment, determination, resilience, and resources. Rather than intermittent glib rainbowism every time we win the Rugby World Cup, unifying South Africans means ending deeply entrenched inequalities in wealth, income and opportunities, and impoverishment. Reparative justice. A second challenge of academics is the responsibilities of social justice scholarship beyond the publishing of an article and a book. Something to which scholars and universities give very little attention. Despite talk about engagement and engaged universities, there is little institutional support for pursuing reparative justice, whether through research or through research and related actions. A final issue concerns the scholar involved in knowledge making, if this knowledge is meant to serve impoverished communities. Biopolitics shapes what we research, the conceptual lens that we employ, the questions that we ask and pursue, what we prioritize, and what we publish. Scholars are not value-free, neutral seekers of truth, as they often like to claim. We always speak from a particular location in the power structure. Nobody escapes the class, sexual, gender, spiritual, linguistic, geographical, and racial hierarchies within which we are all located. Advancing decolonial thinking and knowing means contesting imperial, disembodied, and unlocated assumptions about knowledge and knowledge-making, and revealing the hidden geo and biographical politics of knowledge of imperial epistemology, which we have embraced for decades. This leads me to the matter of reparative justice as decoloniality. My focus is on the knowledge domain, even though neither reparative justice nor decoloniality are about knowledge alone. They're about far more. Colonialism, and let's be blunt, conquest, occupation, extermination, subjugation, dispossession, exploitation, dehumanization, exclusion, and marginalization, which the US and the rest of Africa is also very familiar with. I mention that because there are colleagues here from the US and the rest of Africa. Wreaked havoc on indigenous and black people, not only physically. It also impacted thinking and thought, particularly around how the colonized, how we came to acquire knowledge, understand our history, comprehend our world, and define ourselves. If colonialism refers to the domination of one country by another, the concept of coloniality points to the enduring patterns of power and a way of thinking and behaving that emerged from colonialism but survived long after its seeming demise. Hello, it's alive and well, including in South Africa, that kind of thinking. Its merit, coloniality's merit as a concept, is that it goes beyond the consequences of colonialism in the economic and political domains. It draws attention to A, the Eurocentric epistemology, ontology, and ideology that underpinned and legitimized European domination and European knowledge with its own colonial epistemic monoculture. And B, it points to the concomitant decimation, erosion, and marginalization of the knowledges, cultures, languages, and experiences of colonized people. And these colonized people make up the majority of the world. Predicated on an imperialist and racist outlook and economic and political power linked to colonial domination, European epistemology unilaterally assumed the right to stipulate what knowledge was and how it was produced, proclaiming its scientific truths, universal and valid across all time and space. We don't have that kind of arrogance, really, when we produce knowledge in Little Makanda and proclaim it to be universally valid. Eurocentrism was constitutive of the geoculture of the modern world and powerfully shaped science and knowledge in universities everywhere. Eurocentrism is an impediment to human understanding, and in Edward Said's words, to a genuine cosmopolitan or internationalist perspective. It wields power. This Eurocentrism wields power today because it is sustained through the exercise of material power in the world. Think the United States here. Because material power shapes the possibilities of knowledge production, what research gets funded and doesn't get funded, of who the research serves and does not serve. In opposition to the oppression and repression of coloniality, decoloniality seeks to rehumanize the world, to break hierarchies of difference that dehumanizes subjects and communities and destroys nature. It seeks to produce counter-discourses, counter-knowledges, counter-creative acts, practices that can dismantle coloniality and open up multiple forms of being. That's what our communities need, not the standard, I must be polite, not the standard stuff from the past. It advances a conception of a human future based on other values, principles and logics than those that underpin the current neoliberal order that inflicts suffering on millions of people, billions, that devastates the environment and incubates the Anthropocene. The decolonial turn, let us be clear, is not a turn to nativism that harks back to some pure and glorious past and anachronistic nationalism. Because where that takes us is to Modi and the Hindutvas and all kinds of fundamentalisms. Indeed, it is a struggle to appropriate, subsume, and refine the emancipatory rhetoric of modernity in order to understand citizenship, democracy, economic relations, human rights, and humanity beyond the modern definitions of Europe. It is a basis from which to study Africa from inside and generate endogenous intellectual discourses, and thus enable us as Africans to speak for ourselves, about ourselves, in a non-hegemonic conversation with the world. You and I go to conferences where people want to tell us more about our own society because they assume we are ignorant. That because they have the resources of the libraries, they know more than us. And how often do we accept this and turn the other cheek? A decolonial approach can only be the result of a critical dialogue between diverse cultural, epistemic, ethical projects towards a pluriversal world rather than a universal world in the image of the West. Western modern science possessing the monopoly of the universal distinction between true and false to the detriment of alternative bodies of knowledge results in a global cognitive injustice. The struggle for global social justice must therefore necessarily be a struggle for cognitive justice as well. And pursuing this reparative cognitive justice means being alert not only to other forms of knowledge, but also to diverse communities of problem solving. What one offers then is a democratic imagination, where conversation, reciprocity, and translation create knowledge not as an expert, almost zero-sum view of the world, but as a collaboration of memories, legacies, heritages, and so on. This proposition, if taken on board, has considerable implications for community engagement. The knowledge tasks, as I see it, are twofold: to confront dominant epistemologies and theories that are oblivious to their Eurocentrism, and to build academic and institutional cultures at our universities and in the South that respect epistemological difference and diversity and social justice in knowledge making. Just a sidetrack from the paper. At the University of the Western Cape in the 1990s or the 1980s during anti-apartheid struggle days, we used to speak about giving physical access to students, to black students who were denied access. From there, we went to physical access not being enough. It had to be epistemological access. We cannot speak about the same thing today, because today we have to ask the question, which epistemologies? Just the dominant ones? Because that's not decolonizing. That's not transforming. So the question of which epistemologies becomes critical. And this is hard work. Let's not be shy about this. This is hard work. I want to offer 6 theses on universities and reparative justice in South Africa. Thesis 1. The departure point of reparative justice is deeply entrenched and pervasive coloniality that profoundly shapes contemporary life. in South Africa and in many places. Thesis 2, individual reparations are inadequate. Harms were not just individual human rights violations, but systemic, inflicted on a whole population and on various social classes and groups. Beyond substantive material reparations, the transformation of economic and social relations and institutions is necessary for social justice for the excluded, the oppressed, and the marginalized. Thesis 3, undoing coloniality requires a reparative justice scholarship. It needs thinking, it needs knowledge. Decolonial thinking provides one fertile intellectual frame for such a scholarship, but it is not the only frame. Other theoretical traditions also lend themselves to reparative social justice. I'm wanting to insist on this because of the, everyone is decolonial now. And yet, people deploying decolonial theory and the concept of decoloniality have abstracted it from politics. It's just good enough being decolonial in your thinking, but what it implies for practice is never worked out, it seems. A reparative justice scholarship must be thinking and theorizing from Africa and the global South, that decenters European epistemology and theories and recenters more fertile conceptual frames. Concomitantly, it's a challenge for all of us, scholars must ontologically decenter and recenter themselves. Because you can't produce that work without you going through some major transformation yourself, personally and theoretically. And reparative justice scholarship is not a purely academic project for promotions. It must simultaneously be a social justice project without conflating or confusing the two. In a recent book published last year, Research and Activism, the activist research of Ruth First, I argue that not all engaged research is critical research. And not all critical research is activist research. Reparative justice scholarship has to be engaged, critical, and activist, and transformative in intent. It must contest received notions of justice, innovate theoretically and conceptually, and be linked to social action and practice. Community engagement, of course, has a vital role to play here. Thesis 5. It is critical to clarify from the outset how and to what extent the reparative justice issues that arise from your scholarship will be pursued by you and your university. The question of institutional support is an important matter. Reparative justice work is demanding and requires organizational capacities and a range of individual capabilities. It is painful work. It is disheartening work sometimes. It requires resilience too. Thesis 6. Coloniality confers privileges along axes of race, class, gender, etc. Its beneficiaries may accommodate measures of positive discrimination that operate in terms of individual historical rectification, but they are bound to resist strongly far-reaching institutional transformations that are essential for substantive reparative justice. It means that reparative justice scholarship and actions will be inevitably contested and sites of struggle both within and outside universities. You cannot be romantic and naive about these matters. I want to end off by saying that social and reparative justice work requires courage of different kinds. One is the intellectual courage to think independently and critically about prevailing practices that are harmful and to boldly critique, contest, and challenge them. Do we have the courage? Another is moral courage to pursue the truth, to call out oppression, and advocate for reparative justice. A third kind is social courage, to care, to love, to be kind, to make oneself vulnerable to the probability of injury and hurt for daring to pursue social justice. People get assassinated in our country. when they stand up for justice. Finally, there's physical courage, being prepared to lead, to be on the front line, to literally put your body on the line. Without courage, values are platitudes, and love, kindness, and generosity superficial, on display only as convenience, and when societal and institutional pressures and sanctions are low. Without courage, a person cannot stand up for what he/she believes in, or make difficult decisions that require moral fortitude. Courage is not the absence of fear, about being fearless. It is about preventing fear from stopping us from doing what is right and what is required. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Badat. We have enough time for 3 questions, so standard procedure. I'm going to ask for a runner with a microphone to go around. Kindly raise your hand, please. If you are able, stand so that the camera can catch you when you ask your question. And of course, if time runs out or you'd rather share an input, the QR code is already up there. We've already seen some wonderful inputs from this morning that will make Dr. Maestry's writing and hunting for a co-author much easier for her. All right. I see one hand over here. Can I please see a second hand? Second hand from Dr. Fongwa. Third hand. Going once. Going sold over there. All right. First hand. If you'd be so kind just to stand for the camera to catch you.
My name is Sam. Thank you for that really interesting talk. I'm not going to stand because I've written down my question and I need to see it. So I am just wondering about the sort of extent of the duties of universities as reparative institutions. Obviously, you know, the idea is that they must attempt to repair their sort of historical harms. But what is the extent of that duty, given that, you know, in many instances of, you know, for example, especially community engagement, the university is also taking up the slack of other institutional actors who are failing to fulfill their own moral duties and are also inflicting harm. So, yeah, that's just a question about the limits, I guess.
Thank you very much, Sam. Just to check, Prof, are you happy to take a round of questions? All right, perfect. Dr. Fongwa, I think you, second question over there.
Thanks, Prof, for your talk, and good to see you again. Prof, in your talk, you actually went...
And if you can stand, Dr. Fongwa. Just for the
sorry.
camera, yeah.
You went at length talking about the role of place, geography, history, relationships, the ability to inhabit. But in your propositions, you focus more on the intellectual project for reparations. Can you kindly just make some comments to link the place and the intellectual knowledge project?
Thank you very much. And then the third question, I believe, is right over there. Yeah.
Greetings to the House at Large. My name is Ubongani Momonti from Nelson Mandela University. My first question, I've got 3 questions, Prof. The first question, the lady there had already more or less asked about it, about the extent and capacity, or in my question, is it okay to expect the universities or institutions of higher learning to be the sole leaders of this transformative or reparative justice? Also the discussion that is coming from the emerging discussions of positioning universities as dominant, the power struggles between universities and communities themselves. So that's the first question. Is it correct, or is it okay to expect universities to lead this discussion, and what extent can they do that? The second one, it is then the next 2 questions are just to provoke thoughts also from our colleagues that are here that are in power, positions of power in institutions of higher learning. The first question is, why do you think that institutions of higher learning are resistant to advance transformative reparation and justice to its totality? Because we have this in community engagement, which is the emerging discussions where we're saying that community engagement is not just a process of outreach, or in economics they would call it a short run supply, where we just fix problems just to pass them by. And the last question is, now for the institutions itself, what are the consequences that institutions of higher learning, considering the current colonial capitalist architecture, so what are the consequences that the institutions of higher learning will have to bear should they honestly and intentionally, you speak about the truth, and Prof. Gates spoke about it as well, should they intentionally embark on this reparative justice, in brackets transformation, in its totality? So what are the consequences that the institutions will bear? So just for the provocative intention of understanding, yeah, sorry for, yeah.
Thank you, Bongani, and thank you to all the questions. Prof. Badat, are you happy to answer?
All the questions are related amongst the speakers also, except Samuel, I'll come back to you. So I think the moment I link community engagement and the role of the university to its knowledge functions, it delimits the functions of a university. The university is not a hospital. University is not the state. So there are limits to what a university can do before you make it all things to all people. And then it becomes completely subject to a demand overload, and it collapses. Universities are not good at doing certain things, so they shouldn't do those things, right? So for me, there are limits. It's not universities can do everything, can take on everything. And certainly, and maybe it will come out a little later, there are limits to taking on the functions of the state, whether the local state or the regional state or the national state. Our universities don't even have resources to support academics and students properly right now, let alone divert their own resources to address other kinds of issues. That's not selfishness. That is about campaigning for other parts of the state to take their responsibilities, okay? So I think we must be very clear on the knowledge focus, which is why I said, perhaps provocatively to some of you, I can't see what the community engagement is all about unless you're really good in teaching and learning and research. Otherwise, what kind of knowledge are you taking to communities or engaging with communities around? And community engagement, I think we're all clear, is not charity work. It's not soup kitchens. The Rhodes promotion criteria are very clear. I chaired those promotions criteria and warned in Senate whether you understood what you are doing, because I supported it. The fact that you serve on Victoria School's governing body, that's not community engagement. That's civic duty. Good for you. Making soup on a Saturday morning, wonderful. But don't put that in your community engagement portfolio and claim promotion for those things. So we have to be very clear about what community engagement is and what it's not, and have parameters around that. Having said that, these things are not permanent. You know, when you are confronted with crises, you have to rethink those things all the time. What are the parameters? What are the boundaries? You know, if I do this, what might be the implications? If we don't do this, what are the implications? Not just for our students and our academics, but for people around us, the people who make the food at this university, and so on. You know, can you only have water for yourself and ignore the fact that other people don't have water, and so on? These are hard moral dilemmas, political dilemmas, and it means a lot of sober thinking about how you approach these things, you know, at the level of principle, level of strategies, the level of tactics, and all those kinds of things. Okay. So I'm not sure, you know, I'm not sure what you mean by totality, except that I have to interpret it that, you know, we are a long way from the kind of constitutional changes that we were promised in 1994. Still a very long way. That for me is the totality. Economic, social, reproductive, all kinds of rights have still got to be realized in this country. We are a long way from that. So if that's the totality, bringing in the economic, the political, and all the other kinds of things, then what can universities contribute? The answer is the same. Universities have to be modest about what they can contribute. Universities can produce graduates. Universities can't create jobs. It's a myth that universities create jobs. Jobs are created by the economy. They're created either through sensible policies from the state or whether the capitalists invest or don't invest, whether they sit on their money, right? Universities don't create those jobs. It's very nice to hear all the time. We have, vice chancellors have enough of this, being hit on the head, that you don't produce people who can create jobs. Well, it's not our responsibility as universities to create jobs. We produce the graduates who can occupy those jobs and hopefully in time create jobs through setting up their own enterprises. But that's not the function of the university. It's not the function of the university when someone graduates to put the Standard Bank blazer on them, you know, one Anglo-American blazer on them. Because that's what some businesses want. Only when they fit their blazers will they be happy. That's not the function of a university. Right? The university provides more widely. The university is also about producing cultivated people, not just the MBAs, me before anyone else. Right. Samuel, to come to your, so Samuel is an author of a very good book on the Anchor Institution and a really nice study on Sol Plaatje University that I had reviewed some time ago. So I think each university, given its location, given its place, this is different. This place, thank goodness, is different from UCT. And UCT is different from WITS. And WITS is different from Sol Plaatje and UWC and so on. Each institution, to the extent that it is serious about an engagement with its society, has to work out for itself what its intellectual project should be and how it would then valorize that intellectual project in many other ways. At the level of community engagement, at the level of teaching and learning, at the level of research. That's why not every university does research, let's be honest. This is a highly research productive university, Rhodes. There are other universities in South Africa who hardly do any research, right? So what would their role be in terms of community engagement if they don't do any research? So each institution, in accordance with what its mission statement is, what its values are, and so on, has to work out its intellectual project, the roles it's going to play, the responsibilities it's going to take on, and then also do it in a sober way by working out how much money there is in the coffers too. Instead of simply dreaming grandiose dreams that is never going to get materialized because the fridge is bare. Right? These are the challenges of vice chancellors, you know, not making huge promises about how you're going to change the world without thinking through your intellectual project and your political and social project and how you're going to sustain and support that. And especially when we work with communities, we have to sustain those things. We mustn't disappoint them. They've been disappointed too many times already by knights in white shining armor, usually, who are coming to salvage them and save them. They don't need that from us. Okay. So sometimes, to answer the question from Nelson Mandela, just to finish off there, I think you have to also recognize the moment that you are in. The fact that we're living in a terrifying world right now. Trump has gone mad. The US is the greatest danger to the world in terms of social justice, peace, and all the good things. You know, you must be blind or deaf if you can't recognize that today. Mandela recognized that in the 1990s. Okay? So we're living at a very particular moment where the good things that we want, like justice, equity, and all that, is being rolled back. They are all dirty words in the United States. Diversity, inclusion, equity, and all that. What is happening in the United States is frightening at universities. I can't imagine it in South Africa. I really can't. I don't think we would stand for it. Right? So academics in US, especially those who are progressive, are having a tough time. How to respond? Okay? So this is a moment, my friend, also to put it, not for adventurism. You must recognize the moment, right? We are not in a transformative moment. This is, in using Gramsci's terms, war of position, not war of movement. You have to fight for reforms. You have to fight for improvements, but never giving up the wider goal. Real social justice for everyone. But how we get there means being very sensible of how we tackle things and so on. This is not 1994 now. We are 2026, and the South Africa we know has changed. And the prospects for substantive change are far less today than they were 30 years ago.
Thank you, Ngokeli. It feels more appropriate to say that with your closing sentiments there. We're going to segue from here, and I know I'm so sorry, Tamara. I'm going to beg your indulgence just to protect the time we have available. Please do, please do. We will find a way to get it to Prof. Badat. Yes, yeah. So just to confirm to everyone, all the questions there, we will find a way in time to either get back to as a consolidated response or, where possible, a response to you directly. The next part, and Prof. Badat isn't going anywhere, is one of 3 launches that will be taking place over the next 2.5 days. I'm not quite sure how Di and Margie managed to make that happen. But this is one of 3 launches, and this one is for Prof. Badat's latest book, entitled The Roads to Rhodes University and Beyond, Adventures in Knowledge and Activism. I'd like to invite Professor Sam Naidu, who will be guiding us through this process. And then, if we could have the roaming mic, just to hand over to Prof. Naidu, and then Prof. Naidu, the floor will be yours. Can I just see where the roaming mic is? No. There's a mic there for you. Mr. Enver Lottering will bring it for you just now.
Okay, how does that sound? Good? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be part of this launch, the very first official launch of Professor Badat's latest book, Roads to Rhodes, University and Beyond, Adventures in Knowledge and Activism, and this is published by UKZN Press. Many of you have just heard his keynote, and of course some of you are former colleagues, so I'm not going to do any kind of introduction. I'm going to launch straight into it. The format is very simple. I'll begin by asking Professor Badat a few questions, and then we'll open to the floor. So let's kick off, Salim. My first question, can you tell us please about the motivation behind this 5th single-authored book, and also just give us a brief précis?
Sure, and let me just quickly begin by thanking Di for this opportunity to have this first launch here. I think it's appropriate it's happening at Rhodes. And secondly, thank you for reading the book. So initially the book was intended as first a critical reflection on my 8 years at Rhodes, including whatever self-criticism was needed. And second, it was meant to be a commentary on some critical issues related to universities in South Africa. Right. You have to make space for serendipity when you research and writing. You can't just be fixed. And the reason for doing that, amongst many other research priorities I have, was that I believe that it was really important for vice-chancellors, especially black vice-chancellors of historically white universities, to write about their experiences. So I was introduced as the first black vice-chancellor of this university in 102 years. Others like Jonathan Johnson, Loyusa Nonkwa, Mampela Rampela were also the first black vice-chancellors of so-called prestigious research universities. I'm keen for our vice-chancellors, because they are vice-chancellors, they're not hospital heads or business leaders, to contribute to scholarship in this area of thinking about universities and leadership and so on. To write about what it means to lead a university. I can tell you, one of the most difficult jobs on earth. How they got to lead, how they led, what they think they achieved critically, and from the vantage point of hindsight, what might they have done differently? And I speak about what I might have done differently at Rhodes. So, along the way, as usually happens, a very close and good comrade and friend of mine, Robert van Niekerk, who was a scholar here, he's now at Wits, knowing my history, became adamant that my biopolitics was important. And the book should also include the roads to Rhodes, not just roads. Okay? So in a quick nutshell, parts 1 and 3 are memoir, not autobiography. A memoir that cover my political activism as a student activist, as a political activist, and my sojourn at various institutions, the University of Durban-Westville, Natal University, University of Cape Town, grassroots community newspaper in Cape Town when I gave up my studies, the University of Western Cape, the Council on Higher Education, the Mellon Foundation. So parts 1 and 3 cover those issues. Part 2 is a critical reflection of my 8 years at Rhodes University. What I came here to try and achieve, and to what extent I achieved it or didn't achieve it. And then last part are critical essays on the current university in South Africa. 3 essays, one on leadership and leading universities, one on transformation, and on the contemporary university in South Africa.
Thank you, Salim. That all sounds very, very serious and quite dense, but I can assure you that all of it is infused with Salim's hallmark wry wit and extreme candor, which I'm sure we have appreciated in his keynote as well. So just to move on to talk about the foreword, which was written by Wasim Mahmoud. It describes the book as not simply a memoir, it is a book of ideas that weaves your personal journey into the wider political and institutional evolution of South Africa. Indeed, the book is a remarkable blend of genres, memoir, national history, socio-political commentary, philosophy, which I was quite struck by because you tackle the hugely pertinent topic of ethical leadership in our beleaguered context. And also it incorporates higher education scholarship. So my question has to do with these generic strands. Which one did you find the most challenging to write, given the courageous and refreshing honesty of the book? And how did you manage to integrate these strands into a coherent narrative? I suppose as a literary studies scholar, I'm asking you about the key themes and motifs that underpin the narrative, as well as your authorial strategy.
So I think you've put it well. There are many different themes, different kind of genres floating about in the book. And if it is coherent, then I have 2 people to thank. One is someone I hugely respect, is Paul Malem, Professor of History Emeritus Professor at Rhodes University. I'll share a quick secret with you. The last 3 books that I have published, and they're all substantial, 300-400-page books, every one of them has been read by Paul Malem, not as an anonymous peer reviewer, as a critical reader. So those of you who are still scholars making your way, go and find critical readers. They can be people you respect, admire, they can be your friend, but they may not remain your friends if you don't have a thick skin. Critical readers are meant to give you critique. And then when you go to a peer reviewer, anonymous peer reviewer, it gets so much easier. That was the history of this book. Paul gave me all the critique. It started out at 180,000 words. Paul said, "You're crazy." I said, "Now, again, you want to why don't you just chop me up, you know?" Right? He says, "Bring it down to 80,000. I said, "Paul, that's impossible." UKZN president said, "We'll go with 120,000. Right? So a critical reader is really important. And you know the beauty of it is Paul doesn't expect to be paid for that. It's part of his responsibility as an academic. Right? So find yourselves critical readers. And secondly, in this case, I worked for the first time after being advised by my good friend Robbie van Niekerk to use Current Press in Cape Town. And she did a magnificent job. I was swearing at her at times. She was painful sometimes. Every footnote had to be found. Every page number had to be found. But that kind of meticulousness is what you want from a copy editor. And so they really help you take your ideas and so on, panel beat it. They may even say reorganize some things. Paul also said that. So if it's coherent, I'm really glad, but I want to thank Paul and Current Press for working with me on that. Okay, so the easy part, Sam, was the higher education scholarship part and the social political commentary part. I have a lot of practice on both, from writing books, papers, newspaper articles, and things like that. The most difficult part, undoubtedly, was the memoir part. Firstly, I had to have some parameters around that and ensure that it didn't become autobiography. Now, some of you are really perhaps inquisitive. Will say, yeah, but he's not telling us much about his personal life. And no, it's not about my personal life and my family and so on. Right? It's memoir of a certain kind. So you have to put parameters on that, where you don't stray too much, and so on. Right? The second part is you have to decide which personal, political, academic experiences to narrate and which to leave out. Because this is you're talking about 55, 60 years that you have lived. And long periods. There are many stories that you can share. But who wants to read 800 pages of those? It might be good catharsis for you, but it's a pain for the reader. So you have to really be careful about what you include, what you don't include, and set the parameters for that. And then thirdly, and it became an issue with and I want to declare that, it became an issue with one peer reviewer, the other peer reviewer disagreed, UKZN Press disagreed. I had to become very conscious at some point of the danger of being accused of name dropping. Okay. I had to wrestle of how to avoid that in a context where my life has been really blessed. I've connected with so many outstanding people, locally, nationally, internationally, black and white, women and men, from all walks of life, right? So when I speak about them, I have to mention their names. I can't anonymize them. It will be doing a disservice to them. So I have to speak about working with and being friends with Trevor Manuel or other ministers and so on because of my political background. But I was becoming very aware, and one peer reviewer said, this could be seeming to be name dropping. How do you deal with that? He didn't offer a strategy, and the strategy he offered was simply not going to work. You could not anonymize all those things. So those were the challenges. The memoir parts were real challenges for those kinds of reasons.
Okay. Thanks very much, Salim. I want to move on to what is most pertinent to us. That's chapter 17, titled Building Community Engagement. You describe your championing of community engagement at Rhodes University in this chapter. Can you please give us a brief overview of how you went about this crusade, and I'm using that word advisedly, both conceptually and practically when you were the Vice-Chancellor of Rhodes University?
So I went about it in the way that Rampela describes on the cover of the book. Fire in the heart, ice in the head. Because you need both. And I find it's a very good foil. To be passionate, but also be sober. Because it's the easiest thing to start things as a vice-chancellor. Can you sustain those things, right? Vice-chancellors, I suspect, like to leave legacies, but sometimes they leave terrible legacies because those things that they leave are not going to survive. There aren't other champions and so on. So remember, I came to Rhodes having spent 15 years in political and grassroots activism and having done political education work with workers in trade unions, women, youth, civic organizations in Cape Town. These were very powerful and formative experiences for me. Some of the best things I learned, and especially about democracy, came from people who one would consider uneducated. They were the workers in the trade unions. That's where I learned democracy, real democracy. Right? The universities that I went to, Durban, Westville, Natal, UCT, gave me literacy. And I'm grateful for that. Because sometimes people say the university gave me nothing. It's just not true. University gives you some things that you often don't appreciate, right? But the liberation struggle and the liberation movement that I was part of cultivated a consciousness in me. It gave me a wonderful schooling in ethics and politics, in formulating strategy and tactics, in building mass organizations, in undertaking mass mobilization and actions, and so on. That's something you can't get from a university. There is where you have to have courage and get your hands dirty. Because what you learn there is not something you're going to learn in Sociology 1 or even Sociology 3. You'll learn other things that hopefully are complementary. So my question is, in arriving at Rhodes in 2006 and preparing to come to Rhodes and preparing myself as thoroughly as possible, how could students acquire the consciousness and expertise and skills that I acquired through the liberation movement, through participation in grassroots activism? The answer, community engagement. Could be the only vehicle. Right? So even for those who might have been involved in SASCO and all the others, the student politics that I discovered as a vice-chancellor was not the same as my generations of student politics and so on. So, but not the first generation, I was quite clear of that, not the first generation community engagement. Community engagement as service learning connected to the knowledge functions of the university. Okay. So,
Thank you, Salim. We're getting quite a lot out of Salim today. It's also turning out to be a little bit of a workshop on how to get your book published and how to become the future Vice-Chancellor. So, thank you.
I'm always looking for future Vice-Chancellor.
So in this chapter, Building Community Engagement, you pose two significant questions. These caught my eye. Could community engagement provide Rhodes students with opportunities to develop the expertise and consciousness necessary for remaking South Africa? I suppose you've touched on that quite a bit already. And then the second question, what were the perils when a university might begin to take on functions that were those of the state? And that too has been alluded to already. But I think those are quite significant questions which you answer quite fulsomely in the book, but perhaps you can provide some brief answers now.
So, I think where the university tries to take on functions that really belong to others, the perils are many. Right? Of course, we must engage with the state and support it, if possible, where there is an identity of values and things like that. In making decisions in the face of failures of the state, we have to very soberly navigate questions of principles, strategy, tactics, contextual issues, and so on. So this is where, Sam, I really believe that coming to Rhodes from a liberation movement background gave me the kinds of resources that other vice-chancellors would not have, those who were not involved in political activities and so on, right? In fact, I used to joke sometimes that I wish Rhodes was a bit more challenging, you know. I didn't find it challenging enough sometimes, right? Because there was too much trite conventional wisdoms flying around. It wasn't like real intellectual kind of questions or challenges, you know. Because when you've been in a liberation movement and it's a life and death issue, you have confronted all these things, you know. You have people's lives in your hands when you are mass mobilizing, when you're organizing and things like that, right? These are life and death issues that we had to go through. People whose brains were blown out, people that you knew and things like that, right? So that's where the soberness comes from, the ice in the head comes from, about what can happen if you are maverick, if you're adventurous and voluntarist and so on. So let me put it this way. It's one thing to run a small botanical garden on a 99-year lease, like Rhodes does, with funding from someone else. I'm all for that. It's quite another thing for Rhodes to imagine that it can build a power plant that will supply energy not only to Rhodes, but the whole of Makanda. It's quite another thing for Rhodes to imagine, or any university to imagine, that it can create a water treatment facility, much needed, and supply the whole of the town. That will divert resources, and not just resources of a material nature, of an intellectual nature. That's not what universities are set up for. Even if they're anchor institutions, like Salt Blakey wants to, you know. So you simply cannot compensate fully for the failures of the state. Instead, if you're serious, you must critique the state. You must hold the state accountable instead of doing its job, which you cannot do well. And you'll destroy the university. There won't be money for research. There won't be money for student scholarships and so on. So at the end of the day, I think we have to grapple with those issues. We have to navigate all those issues of principles, strategies, and so on. But be careful about seriously debilitating the universities. That's the poison chalice that a vice-chancellor can leave a university, usually after he's gone or she's gone.
Thank you. Salim, you should consider coming back and we'll give you some challenges, some new ones. Okay, so just to whet the appetite of this audience, who are all going to buy the book and read it.
I need the royalties.
I want to comment on how candid some of your anecdotal disclosures are. For example, chapter 23, titled, "He Speaks English So Well," which describes the sometimes casual, sometimes strategic institutional racism you experienced while you were the Vice-Chancellor at Rhodes University. Even going so far as to uncover what appears to be a white supremacist cabal. Your unsent letters, and I'm quoting, unsent letters, written to colleagues who impugned your integrity are particularly revealing about those colleagues, but also about your strategy to cope with institutional racism. But I want to raise two other controversial or sensational points mentioned in the book. First, shortly becoming Vice-Chancellor in 2006, you caused quite a sensation by donating a portion of your salary and also many of the perks that accompanied the Vice-Chancellor position in order to establish a scholarship fund in the name of Jakes Gerwel. And perhaps you can say something about that very groundbreaking decision, and unusual, I should say, in our rather avaricious social political context. The second point is the sabotaging of your application for the post of Vice-Chancellor at UWC, which is described in explicit detail as being caused by, quote, colored chauvinism. Without giving too much of the book's content away, please can you comment on these 2 points?
Right. So white supremacist cabal are your words, eh? Not mine. Right. But no, but more seriously, I think there was a grouping at Rhodes that imagined that Rhodes belonged to them. And this grouping comes from a particular lineage, right? It's generations, right? And it was cute to see how much they loved the institution. But they loved it so much they didn't want it to change too much, because otherwise they wouldn't love it, right? So that was a game that was going on. So I've tried to be really honest in my reflections, as you say, candid, but without being sensationalist so you can all buy the books, right? So it's really curious how much publicity that act of mine, I was surprised. And really, at that point in 2005, 2006, I was at the Council on Higher Education, so I knew a lot about universities as heading the advisory body to the minister. I knew more about some universities than they knew about themselves sometimes. Because remember, we were also doing institutional audits of every university. So we had insights into university that many people did not have and so on. So I was starting to get really worried about some things. And there was a discussion when I became Vice Chancellor at University South Africa, then Higher Education South Africa. And the topic was Vice Chancellor salaries. I raised my concerns about the extent to which Vice Chancellor salaries were going north. Right? It was becoming indecent. Secondly, I raised my concern about what would happen to universities and communities when Vice Chancellors who were in the past earned not much more than senior professors began to earn 5 times more than senior professors and so on. And then what would happen to a community like a university that also comprised workers? What would happen to this community when Vice Chancellors earn 50 times what the lowest paid worker earns? Right? That was my concern. What we were going to do to our universities. There wasn't a lot of participation in that discussion. You know, trite comments like, we don't set our salaries. The council sets the salaries. That's true. Councils are the problem sometimes. Because they imagine that you can only be a good vice chancellor if you get paid as much as Anglo-Americans' CEO or something like that. It doesn't happen, right? So those were my real concerns. And it wasn't about, you know, shaming anyone or anything of that sort. And actually, if you look at Vice Chancellor salaries today, it's crazy what some Vice Chancellors are earning. It's really crazy. And what it does to the community of the institution. The other thing is, you know, it's a very practical thing, Sam. I'm not the kind of person who can get onto the plane, and if we are both getting onto the plane, you go in the back and I sit in the front. I mean, I would be embarrassed by that. I'd feel very awkward about that, right? So I came to a deal with the Rhodes about what would happen and why we would give up those benefits and so on. And I'm very pleased to say that my deputy vice chancellors and other senior managers at Rhodes also fell into line. So annually we were saving millions of rands by no 5-star hotels, by no business class flights, and so on, by giving up all those. And then we stopped performance bonuses too. Because at some universities, the one in Joburg, the performance bonuses of their directors was higher than our salaries of our senior managers. Their performance bonuses were higher. This is a system that's gone crazy. You're earning 3-4 million already, and then you must get a performance bonus of 600,000-700,000 a year, right? So, yeah.
Okay, I see you're conveniently skipping the second part, but that's all right. No, it's okay. Do you want to?
No, so very quickly, UWC. So let me be clear and declare. UWC has a very special place in my heart. It's where I was an early career scholar for 10 years. UWC is the place that made me. It allowed me to thrive as a young scholar at that place. And so when Jake Gerwel said, and it's ironic when it was said, we were driving to Monument for graduation ceremonies. He was the chancellor. In his understated way, he said, will you go to UWC? Yes, I will go to UWC. Brian O'Connell's retiring in 2 years. I want you to seriously think about it. And when Brian O'Connell heard about the prospect of me going there, he was excited because he was not retiring because he was trying to find someone. And he didn't imagine I would leave Rhodes for UWC, right? Cut a long story short, as you're saying, colored chauvinism raised its head. Some people seem to think that is a university that must be led by coloreds. Right? And then there were major governance problems there between the chair of council and Brian O'Connell. And Brian had made me a promise that he would sort those problems out. It's hard enough being a vice chancellor without having those governance problems. And those problems were not sorted out. I couldn't come back to Rhodes because I'd already said publicly, I want to move on. So it would be wrong for me to come back at Rhodes. Thankfully, Earl Lewis had become the president of the Mellon Foundation in New York and had said to me, when you're ready, there's a job for you in New York. And so I went to New York.
Thank you, Salim. Thank you for being honest, as always. And I'm wondering if you hadn't decided to reject those perks and the salary and so on, if you would need the royalties as much as you do now. It's sort of caught up with you, hasn't it? Anyway. Okay, I'll just come to my final question, and it's about morale and motivation in a world that has seen the rise of, well, you know it, right-wing, retrograde, warmongering, fascism in the last few years. In short, what practical inspiration does your book offer for academics today who contend with increasing demands and dysfunctionality at institutional, national, and global levels?
Okay, so Sam, throughout my life, I've really tried to lead where I have had leadership positions. I've tried to lead in a way that challenges people on many scores, but never paralyzes them at the end of it. Because sometimes you can challenge people in such a way that people get paralyzed. They don't know what to do. What can they do? Right? So I've always been very mindful, both in activism and so on, about challenging people without paralyzing them. So in the last chapter of the book on the university in South Africa today, I use Antonio Gramsci's notion of an organic crisis. And I argue that the university in South Africa is in an organic crisis. It is an organic crisis because it's ideological, political, economic, and educational. And you can see it around us. So that's the bad news. And don't depend on the state to fix those problems, because it doesn't have the leadership capabilities itself. Let's be blunt about that. Right? So I mentor a number of early career scholars, and my heart goes out to them about the conditions that they are experiencing and the demand overload on them. It's not what I had at UWC in my first 10 years. I was able to thrive at UWC. So I have had to accept that as much as I can support them, I can't change their institutional conditions. They have to navigate that. I can only give them advice, about how to do those kinds of things. The financial squeeze and the dysfunctionality of many of our universities is clear to see. And sometimes it's leadership. It is problems of leadership at our universities. Either a seeming incapability to lead or laziness or whatever it is. But we have serious problems, and we mustn't gloss over that. And this is not to make you depressed now. It's just the reality. We have to deal, how do we deal with this thing, right? So a pessimism of the intellect, if you like, but I've always had an optimism of the will. I think things can change. I think things can change very fast. Sitting in London in 1988, I never imagined being home. Look what happened. You were thinking you were still going to be out there for another 20 years. 1990, things changed. It happened fast, so things can change fast. Right? So my concern is that I think there are too many people at our universities today, and I'm being blunt about this, who have an inadequate grasp of what a university is and what it means to be a scholar, and about the nature of our profession. Too many, it seems to me, are interested in status and material rewards. Let me be blunt about that. They are careerists, right? At the same time, in seeing this, I also take inspiration, and I really do, from the committed, the outstanding and serious scholars that I see around me, like yourself, who creatively and diligently teach, cultivate students, research, and undertake community engagement. There is a critical mass at all our universities of that kind of people, and my hope is they will reproduce themselves and not give in to the careerists who are there for other reasons, right? What will I hope that people take from this book? I hope Rhodes academics will take from this book what the adventure and the transformation agenda was in 2006, and critically assess, where are you today? What's still having to be done? How much has been achieved or not achieved? More generally, what I think other academics, I hope, will take from this book at other universities, and there are going to be launches virtually at every university, is that I hope academics start to realize, not just because I'm telling them this, how much power and authority they have ceded to corporatist administrators. Wake up, guys. Right? I hope that they will start to assert themselves and reclaim senates and universities from these corporatist, highly paid administrators. Right? Agent is not just going to happen. What? Courage. Agency, organization is required. Academics are not organized, and concerted action is going to be critical. Yeah, I'm now speaking as an activist again, right? Because change is not going to happen in some neat, sanitized ways. Change is messy. You have to fight for change, right? And I think we must dream about the possibilities of those change. We must never give up on that. Because if there's no hope, what is there? We might all go to the pub now. You have to have hope. In South Africa, we have space and we have spaces. This is not the United States. This is not Germany or India, where the repression is palpable. I was there a few weeks ago. So I ended my keynote on courage. That's what we need as scholars and academics, courage.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Salim. I think we are ready to take some questions for the floor, and I don't know if you would like a drink of water, because you have been speaking for a long time now. Sake, would you like to chair, or would you like me to?
Happy with whatever you prefer. Do you want to do it? Do you want me to do it for you?
Would you like to take questions from the floor? I think this is a roving microphone, isn't it?
Yeah, there is. I'll take, we've got time for about 3 questions. I'll ask one of our friends. I think we have time for 4 questions. Lucky, how lucky we are. All right, tomorrow, I see your hand is ready, so that's the first hand. I see the second hand here. I see the third hand here. I see the fourth hand there. I do see you, sir. My apologies for that. I'm just trying to gather as many hands as possible. All right, first hand, is someone able to help with this roving mic? Ah, there's a gentleman over there. Right over there.
Afternoon, Prof. Thanks. Damaris Kiewit from the University of the Western Cape. Your legacy project as an activist, how would you ensure community engagement is woven into research and teaching and learning to be meaningful for activism?
Thank you very much, Prof.
So let me take them.
Do you want to take them one by one? Sure.
So, quick answer to that. Winning support for community engagement, institutionalizing community engagement, habituating community engagement, and so on, cannot happen through dirigisme. The Emperor Vice-Chancellor tells everyone that's how it's going to happen. That's not going to sustain it. It will collapse the moment you leave. You've got to fight for that, intellectually, persuasion. I'm tactical in terms of what you can take on at a moment and what you do not take on at a moment, right? So, for example, there was no apology, because I was not going to apologize to anyone during my inaugural for all the bad things Rhodes did, right? It happened 2 years later when the opportunity presented itself to persuade the Senate and Council of this university, because they had to apologize, not me, to apologize for the terrible things Rhodes did during colonialism and apartheid, right? So so it's about reading the moment. So around community engagement, I was quite clear what I wanted to achieve here and why I wanted to achieve it. And I wanted it to be linked to this beautiful slogan that still not much has been done about, in my view, where leaders learn. That's the Rhodes slogan. No one can take that slogan away. But it hasn't been valorized sufficiently. And it could be so strongly linked to community engagement, because that's where the leadership abilities are crafted and so on. Right? So you have to start with your fellow deputy vice chancellors and persuade them. You have to go to the deans and persuade each of them, because their worries is going to be, you're going to take money away now. Taking money away from commerce and giving it to community engagement, and so on. Right? It's all about resources. So you have to persuade all the time. Because even getting new posts, unless there are some vice chancellors or emperors, they can do whatever they want. But if you are a democratic vice chancellor, you have to take people along and show them why, you know, diverting some of these resources will have other benefits for our students and so on. Right? So, short answer, you've got to persuade all the time. And you've got to do it soberly. You've got to look at the budget all the time and make guesses about, we can divert 2 million this year. They won't say much because we had a good year, that kind of stuff, right? So it's really about being principled, knowing what you want to achieve in terms of a vision, but then formulating the strategy and tactics and being patient.
Thank you, Professor.
Must make it part of the budget. Must be in the budget.
Thank you very much, Prof. My name is Rosalind from the University of Free State. And I just want to commend you on what you said about leadership. And when you, especially that sometimes there are challenges that we experience in the universities, and we tend to put blame on, we say the modules are high risk, the lecturer is not working, but we never consider the challenge of leadership, because they always say that the leadership must always lead. So I just want to really comment on you on what you say, because we do experience these things, whether it's a community engagement or whether it's curriculum, or whether it's transformation within the faculty or within the university. The challenge is there with leadership. And maybe just to say, can we take advantage of the fact that you're closer to us, that you really help? It is a need. That's just the comment.
Thank you very much. The third...
So I agree. You know, leadership is critical. I mean, I don't want to make out like people who are vice chancellors and people who are lead are special people. That's not the issue. But leadership is critical, right? It makes the difference between a successful institution and a not successful institution. And I learned very early in my life, right, as a young activist, that normally the people who are blamed are not the problem. When municipal workers are blamed, they're not the problem. It's because the managers are not managing and the directors are not directing and the chief executive is not leading. If people are standing around and not knowing what to do, don't blame the workers. Where's the manager? Of course, I'm not saying workers are pure, right? Workers will skive, workers will do what they can to make their lives more pleasant and so on. But it's a job of managers to manage and directors to direct. That's why they get paid higher salaries. If they can't do that, they must vacate. We have too many passengers in those kinds of areas. People who are not leading, or are fearful of leading, who cannot lead, or have been put into positions too quickly and now are struggling. And when you are put into positions too quickly, I see a pattern emerging. They become authoritarian. It's a lack of confidence. I'm seeing this around. I'm a very keen observer of what happens at leadership levels at our universities. Often, it's people who are not confident. They have abilities and so on, but they've been thrust into that position too quickly, and they become authoritarian because they can't engage intellectually. They don't have the experience and the resources to engage and so on.
Claire, I believe you're next up.
Thank you, Prof. Badat, and I'm looking forward to reading the book and its candid reflections. My name is Claire from Rhodes University / University of Oxford, whatever that means. And I am interested in the distinction between autobiography and memoir and how we decide what to include and exclude. Specifically, I came back to Makanda for a year of fieldwork last year, and I was especially interested in the historical relationship between university and community. And because I'm also a student of Paul Malem, I was intrigued by vice-chancellors like Hislop and Henderson and Badat and Mabizela, and how people relate to them, because whether we like it or not, our vice-chancellors often become emblematic of our institutions. They come to represent institutions. When Mabizela comes into a room, he was vice-chancellor. When I was a first year in 2016, I still feel the need to hold my breath sometimes. And so I thought I'd hear some of those surnames when I was doing fieldwork with community members across the town, and I was hearing a lot of those surnames, but often people weren't referring to the vice-chancellors themselves. They were referring to people in vice-chancellors' families. So wives specifically, because we haven't had any husbands yet. And so I'm intrigued by how we decide what is personal and autobiographical and doesn't count in memoir, and what is personal and relates to the politics, because vice-chancellors aren't, as any scholar, is not just a disembodied figure representing knowledge. They're in place, and they also are in relationships with family and community. So how did you navigate that process of deciding what to include and exclude? Thank you.
No, Claire, honestly, yesterday when I was preparing, I said, please don't ask that question. What's the distinction between an autobiography and a memoir? So I'm being honest. I thought I had an idea, but I can't give you a really smart answer about what the difference is. Maybe she can.
I'm just going to define memoir and autobiography, but I think the onus is still on Salim to answer your question. So an autobiography it's self-evident. It's your life story written by yourself. It's an entire story. It's a narrative with a very specific teleology from beginning to end, whereas a memoir is of a particular specific era, period, even a particular experience. But the levels of intimacy and disclosure and so on are usually the same. But now I'm going to hand over to Salim.
Right, you have the answer. No, but again, honestly, this is, research is not a straightforward process. Where you start and where you end up can be very different, Sometimes you start a book and then you leave it. To my regret, that book should have been out by now, because someone has come with a similar book, the book on the histories of universities in South Africa. So, you're making choices all the time. And with one book, everything was in the head. Halfway through the book, I had to sit down and write the damn research proposal for the book, because I was getting into trouble. I was going all over the place. And I said, yeah, serves you right. You thought you had it all in your head. Now write the proposal about what is the aims and purpose of this book and so on. But it's not a reason not to start, right? Because sometimes you can have a wonderful proposal and it never materializes. Nothing comes out of that. Right? So this is one of those things that, last night it just hit me. What if someone asks a question, what's the difference between autobiography and memoir? Are you talking about it?
Thank you for the provocative question, Claire. I think, Dr. Damons, you had the last question.
So much, Professor Badat. I want to take this historical moment not to leave with historical tension around your framing of limitations and knowing our limitations, being someone that has followed you substantially and under your activism hat. And I want to, just for my own personal clarity, when we were mobilizing against states that had more power than ourselves, there was no notion of limitation. So you were an activist, but you could throw a petrol bomb at the same time without having any military experience. And the intellectual argument was then made why it was necessary to have intellectual capacity and the ability to then produce a Molotov cocktail as the first line of defense for your intellectualness. But the tension I'm having recently now is with a generation of activists that have seemingly consistently pushing the notion in a society and a world that is under tremendous stress. Now we've been told again, as I'll call myself probably a third generation community engager, that know what your limitation is. If you're a director, which I am, your limitation is mainly linked to your KPI and your strategy. It's not linked to my ability to walk into gang-infested areas, to have conversations in ways. Because scholars that we were hoping would be advocating for a more aggressive posture, especially given our history. How do you deal with that tension I'm having around how I'm hearing how you frame in a limitation, given both our historical and contemporary challenges that we face within the academy, but also as a citizen of society? How shouldn't there be a greater call for a different type of thinking, especially when a democratic government loses its moral yardsticks? And are we looking, who do we look to for, who do we look at then to say, what should we be doing, how should we be driving change, and let it stop being superficial, mindful that we're just given this historical moment. This is my historical moment in leadership. How do I deal with such internal tension?
So, look, I've written somewhere about the ANC government squandering the incredible inheritance it got in 1994. It's almost 70% of the population vote for it. And that young woman during the 215, 216 student protest who stood there with that placard captured it beautifully. You made us dream dreams. We are here for the delivery now. So that's so I think what I learned from liberation movement stalwarts and so on, because when you're doing things during that period, which is very different from now, right? This is not, I will not condone Molotov cocktails and things like that now. That was a different state. That was a different regime. We now have a democratic society where you can bring about change by voting. We couldn't do that before, right? So you have to assess the context. You have to assess what is the strength of the state, what is the strength of the people. You have to assess all kinds of things because you are dealing with people's lives, right? So my own approach would be you must carve out the most resolute path that you can, having assessed all the factors and so on. You need to be bold, right? You need to be resolute. But you must not be adventurous. You must not be voluntarist, imagining that you can achieve anything, right? Because that's also dangerous. You can debilitate. You can set back movements for change and things like that. So I like to have the approach, and it's the title of a chapter that I've just written for Bani Pityana. For his Feshkrif, he's turned 80. I call it the bounds of possibility. Bani Pityana, I learned from one of the great black consciousness leaders alongside Steve Biko, speaks about the bounds of possibility. So I'm writing this chapter, sharing it with people who hopefully read it, that for me, Bani Pityana represents this constant pushing of the bounds of possibility, of never settling. Can we do more? Can we push a bit more? You know, would it be dangerous? Would it be maverick? Constantly weighing those things up. So that would be my approach then, and you push the bounds of possibility. You know, be bold, be resolute, be clear about what your end goals are, but being open to different strategies and tactics. In moments of repression, it's foolhardy to be adventurous. In other moments, maybe it's not foolhardy. It's all about calculations at the end of the day. So never compromise on the vision, never abandon or sacrifice and compromise on principles, but flexibility of strategy, tactics, and things like that.
May I kindly invite everyone to just give us one more round of applause for Professor Padat. And Professor Naidu, thank you very much. There are a limited number of copies of the book that are available just as you walk outside of the venue shortly. So please, as Prof. Padat said, and I counted twice, he needs the royalties. If you could be so generous, please pick up a copy, and I'm sure there'll be more information on when further copies are available. Before we break for the last 3 sessions of the day, just some quick administrative announcements. First of all, for day 2 tomorrow, there will be a market throughout the whole day. In the morning, everyone was supposed to receive a voucher for the market. Not everyone was able to receive that voucher. So, at the end of the day of presentations, if you do not have a voucher for the market, please go to where the registration was this morning. You will find Nosi from Roos, who I cannot see, probably setting up, and she will be handing out vouchers for those who do not have for that market later on. The second thing is, there have been some requests for spaces to take Zoom calls or charge devices in between and throughout sessions. Monica Tanga from Roos has organized a venue in, I think it's venue number 5, just down this corridor. There's a limited amount of space, so please go in and out as and when you need. Again, another bit of apology, there is no internet access, but hopefully you can hotspot from your own. And then finally, if you look inside of your bag, everyone should have a blue pamphlet of this nature. After the next 3 presentation sessions, there will be the launch of the UNESCO EpiNet, UniTwin EpiNet program. This will happen at 5 o'clock, between 5 and 5:30, it will start downstairs at the foyer. It will be accompanied and be part of the end of day cocktail. It is with great pleasure that Dai has empowered me to share that there will be cocktails. She hasn't shared what kind of cocktails, and I'm not going to ask. I'll let hope fill the room. But as you finish off the last set of presentations at 5:05, please just go down to the foyer on the ground floor. If you're not quite sure where to go, please just listen out for the sounds of marimbas that will start at 5:05 promptly. And then there'll be a brief launch where we'll hear from a couple of other key guests in the room. All right, we're going to now depart and go on to the next 3 presentation sessions. Session chairs, over to you.